And I think Matt saw the problem here, that he wasn't even willing to grant it was reasonable to believe that Jesus existed or was crucified, which goes against what every mainstream historian will tell you. And Matt's reply to that is, well, I'm not a historian. Okay, then don't go making these kinds of universal pronouncements about history then.
I recently had the pleasure of talking with Trent Horn. We talked for about an hour. We covered a bunch of different topics, but this particular clip that I'm about to play in this video deals just with the conversation that we had around his debate with Matt Dilahunty, where they discussed the question, is the resurrection reasonable? The sort of debrief type conversation that we had, I thought brought some really interesting points to light, and so I'm breaking that out separately here because I think it stands well on its own 2 feet. With that being said, let's dive in.
And so I asked him, well, what would good evidence for the resurrection look like?
Right.
And he said, I don't know what it would look like. I just know that I haven't seen it, because if I've seen it, it would have convinced me. And my response to Matt is, how does he know that? Because it's also possible, because he doesn't know what good evidence looks like, he missed that evidence or dismissed it. Because how could he know he would not miss something if he doesn't even know what it looks like? That's why I gave the example. I believe the example I gave in that debate was of a hygrometer. Like it's a special measuring device. How do you know if you're walking outside a building that you missed seeing a hygrometer? You couldn't say I haven't seen it yet, because you could have seen it. You just don't know what it looks like. If you don't know what good evidence for the resurrection looks like, then you can't know that you haven't seen it yet, or it hasn't been presented to you. You might have just unfairly dismissed it. Matt was operating from a kind of assumption that this evidence, it would just change his mind, almost in a non-rational sort of way. He would just see it and his mind would be changed. And yet I think that Matt is very dismissive of people who look at the evidence for the resurrection of Christ and have that reaction for themselves. So I found his position to be inconsistent in that regard. That my basic argument with Matt was, the resurrection is a conjunction of 3 claims. Jesus was alive, Jesus died, Jesus was seen alive, he died, and he was seen alive again. That's the resurrection claims. And nearly all people find the first 2 unproblematic. Jesus was seen alive at one point, and he died. And so whatever evidence you have for showing he was alive at one point, well, you can show evidence he was alive at another point. Like, people saw him, that they were alive. They were willing to even suffer and risk death to proclaim that they had seen him alive after his death. And I think Matt saw the problem here, that he wasn't even willing to grant it was reasonable to believe that Jesus existed or was crucified, which goes against what every mainstream historian will tell you. And Matt's reply to that is, well, I'm not a historian. Okay, then don't go making these kinds of universal pronouncements about history then.
He then went on to make the claim that you asked him, what is science? And he said, science is knowledge, or it comes from the same word as knowledge, which then, as I was listening to that, raised the question, then wouldn't history be a part of science if science is knowledge? And so then why would you throw out history if it is, in that view, a subset of science?
Yeah, he's thinking that science is only something that's observable in a laboratory with beakers, which of course always involves history. You have to remember the data from your experiments. But many sciences, for example, geology is a historical science. None of us were around, I would say millions of years ago. I know that people might disagree, but millions of years ago, like when the Grand Canyon was formed. Yet we look at the evidences to understand how this process occurred, even though we were not there to observe it, based on what has been left behind. And the same thing, we would do the similar scientific historical investigation of the origins of the Christian faith. None of us were around to see Jesus be crucified or to see the disciples preach his resurrection. What we're left with are the artifacts from that. What would we expect to have if Jesus died, rose again, and then appeared to his followers and gave them the Great Commission to spread the gospel? Well, what we would have is what we exactly find. We have written documents attesting to this. We have the spread of early churches with the oral proclamation of this good news, with it being passed on in things like sacred tradition. We have people being willing to suffer for this belief, a radical change in people's behaviors and worldviews. We have what we would expect to have if Jesus rose from the dead and commissioned his disciples to spread that good news.
See, so this is interesting. This is one of the, I guess, one of these bedrock beliefs that I'm trying to to scratch the surface of in this conversation, where from the viewpoint of, like you said, it's got to be in the lab. It has to be at, something that you can actually observe yourself, something that you can put under a microscope. When that becomes the only valid epistemology in someone's worldview, um, then I can understand why you wouldn't trust eyewitnesses in history. And then adding on top of that, the fact that there are different translations and the way that the Bible was formed, and like all of those things that to me or to you are not problematic, because we have a belief in the supernatural, we have a belief in God, we have a belief in history to.
I would also say it's not problematic for me because I have a belief in the historical record. I don't think the historical record is infallible, but
Mhm.
I think that we can know about many historical events. We find them unproblematic to affirm the story of William Wallace chronicled in the movie Braveheart, even though I think the first account of it was written by a blind minstrel like 150 years later, or other accounts of people in ancient Rome or ancient Greece or in medieval eras that often have less evidence than Jesus. Yet we don't find those historical episodes problematic. We have good historical evidence for knowing the basic foundational elements of the Christian faith, and I have no reason to doubt them. And people who simply appeal to skepticism for skepticism's sake, I don't think that that's really a good way to live when we're trying to understand the world around us.
And although it's not consistent, like you brought up, people accept all kinds of things in history that, that they don't require as much evidence for as the resurrection. I know that the person listening to this right now is going to say yes, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's where this kind of always goes, which I think is important to bring out, just that it exposes that there is a double standard. But it gets down to, I think, the more primary point, which is that your real problem isn't really with the historical record. Your real problem is that there's a claim that exists within the historical record that defies what you believe to be possible, namely the resurrection.
Yeah, and I'm really skeptical of this kind of epistemology. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What does that mean? Does the word extraordinary mean the same thing each time it's used in that statement? It would seem so. So does that mean miraculous claims require miraculous evidence? Well, and that means you can never prove anything because the miraculous evidence would need miraculous evidence of its own to bolster it. Does it mean unusual claims require evidence that is unusual? Well, I would say that yeah, the resurrection is certainly unusual, but the evidence that we have for it, the collection of testimonies both from St. Paul as well as from the accounts of things like group appearances of Jesus to the apostles that's recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, that's very unusual evidence. Most psychologists dismiss the idea that a person can have a group hallucination of something. When people say this, well, extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, I think a lot of times the examples they give, it doesn't really it doesn't really make the point. They'll say, you don't need ordinary, like if I say I have a dog in my house, uh, then you just need the testimony, it's fine. If I say I have a dragon at my house, then you need a lot more evidence or you're a lot more skeptical. But I think we should really ask questions. Well, why do we reach that intuition in that case? I think in a lot of these counter examples, the extraordinary claim counter examples, it's because, like in that case, well, I'm skeptical that you have a dragon in your home because I have good evidence to believe dragons do not exist. Not just that there's a lack of evidence for dragons. I have evidence dragons from zoology. Dragons do not exist because if dragons were a part of the natural ecosystem, then we would observe dragons. We would have dragon fossils. We would have more evidence for them, like we have for other creatures in zoology. But the fact that we have good evidence that dragons do not exist, then that gives me already initial evident reason to doubt your claim, and you would need a lot more to counterbalance that opposing evidence. Now, with the resurrection of Jesus, we do not have similar kinds of evidence that Jesus did not rise from the dead, similar that we have that dragons do not exist. We do not have similar, well, if Jesus rose from the dead, we'd have all this kinds of evidence, and we don't, in the same vein as if dragons existed, we'd have evidence, and we don't. We don't have evidence that shows the proposition Jesus rose from the dead is false. Now, a skeptic might say, well, yeah, we do. We have evidence that people don't rise from the dead. Okay. We have evidence that when you bury them, they stay in the ground and they stay there. And that's the reason that we doubt that Jesus rose from the dead, because of this overarching background claim that that dead people stay dead. But I would say, well, that's not a problem for my worldview. In fact, for Jesus's resurrection to be a miracle, it requires the claim dead people stay dead to be true. If that wasn't true, the resurrection wouldn't be special. If lots of people just rose from the dead randomly, who cares? Jesus did it. The resurrection only stands out because of this background knowledge of the natural states of affairs. That doesn't show that Jesus did not rise from the dead just because most people stay dead. Also, this idea, well, we have this uniform experience and there's nothing that no testimony can overcome it. Yeah, well, that's like, imagine British sailors met people in the Polynesian Islands and they tell them stories about how in the winter in England you can walk across a lake. It's frozen. The Polynesian Islanders would have no idea what they're talking about. Their entire lives and cultural experience is that water is liquid. It's never solid. What, so they have, there's nothing that could change their mind on that, even though they're incorrect. Their universal experience is actually truncated. So people say, well, we have this universal experience that people don't rise from the dead. Well, maybe it's truncated. Maybe there are exceptions to that, like in the case of Jesus rising from the dead because he's God incarnate. I threw a lot out there at you, but hopefully it's a good start.
No, I think that that's very helpful, because I think that and I'm not trying to pick on Matt Dilahunty, but he just represents a particular way of viewing the world. And I think in his mind, and all of the people that feel the same way, the resurrection claim is like the dragon in your house claim. But what I'm interested in is trying to understand essentially the huge gap in perception between someone like myself or someone like you who looks at the world around us, like we've already talked about, morality, consciousness, there's the existence itself, there's all these different factors that we're looking at, and we're saying, not to mention personal direct encounter with God through relationship that we have based on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which gives you that direct knowledge, which is, I never use that as an argument, because it is kind of like the Polynesian example that you use, where it's like, but we've been to a place where water freezes, but and we've been to a place where God is knowable, but that only exists once you've passed from death to life, and once you've actually like entered into a relationship with God through Christ. So it's hard to argue from that personal perspective, because people could just say you're crazy and whatever. So, but my point is, it always seems like it comes back to this sort of God of the gaps idea, or this idea that like we're looking at all of these different indicators in reality, and we're saying that the best explanation for them, as in an affirmative sense,
right,
is a being like God, and then that somehow gets interpreted or heard as if we're saying we can't understand what the explanation for these things is, and so we're just going to fill God into it. And
right,
I this is something I'm very interested in, and this is why I keep going back to the existence of God and the existence of a supernatural, because I do think that it
right.
sits beneath the resurrection. Like if we can't have a conversation around at this level, then I think the resurrection will always sound like a dragon, like you're saying that there's a dragon inside of your house. It will always come across like that.
You know what's interesting is that atheists also engage in God of the gaps reasoning. They will accuse Christians, oh, well, you just think that I don't know what happened, therefore God did it, so your arguments don't work. And yet many atheists will say that they're open-minded. They're willing to change their minds. If you could prove God exists, they would believe. They're open to the evidence. To which then I ask them, all right, what specific evidence would convince you that God exists? So give me, and don't just be vague. Don't just say, well, it has to be repeatable, has to be testable. That's still very vague. Give me a specific illustration. They'll say, all right, if you prayed over an amputee and their limb healed, then I would believe God exists. And I would say, okay, what's your reasoning here? It seems like your reasoning in this case is, I don't know of a natural explanation for what I just observed. Therefore, God did it. Right? That's basically the reasoning that they're using in that
Mm-hmm.
case. So
Mm-hmm.
it's okay for them to have God of the gaps for a very particular hypothetical that they're at least not immediately aware of. But when Christians point out things, and I would say that they're not God of the gaps, by the way. For example, I talked about actualization and potentiality, that we know objects to change or move have to be actualized. They have a potential to move or change. But this actualization series cannot be infinite any more than a train cannot move if it's just an infinite series of boxcars that have potential to move but can't actualize their own potential. Instead, there must be a reality that's pure actuality. And okay, so if pure actuality exists, what is that? It can't be material in nature because matter always has potential. It's not temporal. And you would start to tease out what that is. And you could do similar arguments for a necessary being or the cause of the universe. And here we're arguing from what we know to some kind of a cause and then logically deducing divine attributes from it. It's not God of the gaps reasoning that one is engaging in. I would say atheists, when they propose, here's what would change my mind, it usually is some kind of God of the gaps reasoning, honestly.